Okay. I just got a little pop-up that said recording in progress. So not only, I guess I have to click continue. Okay, can you still see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, the outline went away. Well, the newsletter said I'm talking about night sky photography, so that's what I'm going to talk about. And for some reason there we go. So we're going to talk about how to photograph the Milky Way. And I'm going to really talk about primarily kind of a simple one-shot approach, but I will also talk about some of the more complex approaches with multi-shot, tracked, stacked, those kinds of things, and what the differences are, but I'm not going to get into a lot of details about how to do it. So I'm not sure why this is out of sync. Hang on a minute. My slideshow is not updating. Let's try it again. Maybe this will work. So this is the TLDR version, which that stands for too long, didn't read. So for those of you who have, like me, have been trained by our electronic media to have shorter and shorter attention spans, this is the condensed version. So you want to go out in the warm months of the year, not during December. Generally, you're going to be looking south, maybe southeast, maybe southwest, but it's not going to be to the north. Shoot in RAW mode if you can. Use a sturdy, stable tripod. I've seen a lot of wobbly tripods. Manually focus in live view, and the goal is to make stars as small as you possibly can. And you can zoom in on the live view, but don't zoom the lens if you have a zoom lens, because you want to use the widest angle of view possible. You'll set the camera for manual exposure, somewhere in the ISO 2600 to 3200 or so range. Use the smallest F number that you have available, which might be f4, could be f4.5, depending on the lens, might be f2.8, and somewhere around 30 seconds for the exposure time. And don't trust your camera's LCD, because the image review, the image will be dark, even though it looks bright when you're out in the dark and your eyes are kind of accustomed to the dark. You can use a tungsten or an auto white balance setting. If you like setting the Kelvin temperature itself, somewhere around 4,000, 4,200 generally works well. If you know how to use the mirror lockup on your digital SLR, that will help avoid camera shake and camera vibration. And more important than that is use a self timer or a remote trigger to actually release the shutter to avoid jiggling the camera when you take the photo. So that's the short and sweet version. Now we'll talk about some of the details. So I believe the fundamental purpose of photography is to capture a view that otherwise could not be seen. And that could be to look at the scene later, to share it with someone else, to use technology to reveal in ways that we can't see with our eyes, or even to express your own unique way of seeing. And of course, astrophotography has all of those elements. This is a photo from the Badlands. And one of the nice things this particular evening was there were some real high wispy clouds that I didn't even notice when I was there in person. But looking at the images, you can see how the brighter stars got kind of bloated and fuzzy, and the colors came out a little bit richer in those stars. So it was just one of those happy accidents that gave a little bit nicer result. This is another photo from a different area, also at the Badlands. This is from Death Valley just a few weeks ago, and from Capitol Reef a couple of years ago. And when we talk about the night sky, the primary ingredient is time. And it's going to be time to learn the techniques, time to plan the photo, set up the equipment. Frequently, you'll expose multiple frames so that you can combine them later. And then if you do post-processing, you can spend many happy hours post-processing a single image if you're so inclined. So it takes a lot of time. Just as a for instance, this is my attempt to show what the night sky looked like, to my eye when I was there in person. You could see the brighter stars, you could kind of faintly make out the Milky Way, but for the most part, everything was just dark, and the hills and mountains in the foreground were kind of silhouetted against the sky. The camera, though, with a longer shutter speed, can capture a lot more information and bring out those details that we can't see by eye. And that's really the beauty of night sky photography. With a little bit of post-processing, you can adjust the colors and contrast and brightness and do a little effects in the foreground to darken the foreground where there wasn't much to see and create something a little bit more interesting to look at. With even more post-processing, I brought in one of the foreground frames where a car drove by and illuminated the trees in the foreground, and of course also converted to black and white. So a little more processing, you can get a little bit more dramatic result. Sometimes in fine art photography or fine art landscape photography, we'll use Photoshop to substitute a sky or to swap out a foreground or something to make an image even more compelling. So in this final version, I've actually replaced both the foreground and the sky to create a final version. But the real point of interest here is the Milky Way. You'll hear people talk about Milky Way photography. That's this streak of light going through the sky. And to your eye, it will appear as a kind of a milky streak through the sky. It may be high in the sky, it may be low on the horizon, depending on the time of night and the time of the year. And the Milky Way does have a pretty part, and the pretty part is that bright spot in the center. When we talk about the Milky Way, that's the galaxy that we live in. Now, this happens to be a picture of the Andromeda galaxy, but the Milky Way looks very similar. It's a large disk of a couple 100 billion stars, and we are located kind of out, maybe halfway or 2/3 of the way out in one of the arms. And a lot of the night sky features that we're used to talking about, like the Orion Nebula and so forth, they're all relatively close to us within the Milky Way. But because we're living in this large disk of stars, when we look towards the center, we're looking through lots and lots of stars towards this really bright spot where there are just billions of stars, and so many stars you can't see the individual stars. It's just a bright glow. When we look away from that center, though, we still see a streak, but it's much less defined, and we see fewer stars overall. And when we look up or down, kind of, at a 90-degree angle away from the center, we're looking out into deep space. We see a few stars, but that's where we also start to see a lot of other galaxies that are off in the distance in the universe. We really don't know what's on the other side of the galactic center because it's in the way and we can't really see beyond it in that direction. So we don't really know what's over there. We probably kind of think looks a lot like it does in other directions. During the seasons, during the summer, when we look straight up in the sky, we're looking toward the galactic center. During the winter, in December, when we look up in the sky, we're looking out away from the galactic center. So that's why during the winter, you don't really see the pretty part of the Milky Way. You'll still see the bands of light and you'll still see the Milky Way. And you could even say that every star you see in the sky is part of the Milky Way, but you won't see the pretty part. If you take a wide panoramic view, you can see the pretty part over here on the right, and it'll create kind of an arch across the sky and off into the other side of the sky, in this case, looking south. So this would be looking north. You can see it kind of trailing off as we're looking out away from the galactic center. And when we focus on the galactic center, that's the bright part. That's kind of the pretty bright part. And this brightest part we see here is actually the galactic center. And if we zoom into the galactic center, we can see more details. And one thing I want to point out, just to help you orient yourself when you see Milky Way images, the bright spot is the galactic center. And over here, we can see what's known as the Dark Horse Nebula. And it gets its name because it's shaped kind of like a horse. And some of these other bright stars kind of come and go. For instance, when I took the picture, this was Jupiter and this was Saturn. So sometimes you'll see them in the middle of the horse. Sometimes you'll see them in other places. Sometimes you won't see them at all. And that's an indication of what year the photo was taken. But the dark horse nebula is almost always visible. And it can help you kind of get your bearings of what you're looking at. In general, like I said earlier, the galactic core is always going to be to the south. It'll be to the southeast early in the year, southwest later in the year, but it's always going to be south. And the way I like to remember it, the Milky Way season, early in the year, you can see the Milky Way early in the morning if you get up. So, 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning before sunrise, you can see it. In the middle of the year, middle of the summer, you can see it in the middle of the night from sunset to sunrise. It's kind of up all night. Later in the year, September, October, you can see it late in the evening after sunset, but then it's going to disappear pretty quickly. And in the winter, you won't see it at all. So just some examples. March 2nd of this year, it was dark from around 8 o'clock until 5:30 the next morning. The galactic center didn't come up until 3:12, and then you need to give it an hour or so to get up in the sky. So you would have from, let's say, 4 or 4:30 until 5:30 to photograph the Milky Way. And that particular night, there was no moon. And I just chose these dates at random. May 22nd, a few days ago, it was dark from 10:30 until 4:30. So the night was a lot shorter. Galactic center rose at 11. So you can see it's rising earlier as we go through the year. This particular night, though, the moon came up at 3 a.m. So you would have from around 12:30 or 1 o'clock until 3 o'clock to photograph the Milky Way. July 20th, it'll be dark from 10:30 to 4:40. So we're on the other side of the equinox. Now the galactic center rises at 7. So it's coming up well before sunset. But then it sets at 4 a.m. So it's up really all night. You've got all night to photograph the Milky Way. This particular night, though, the moon comes up at 1 a.m. and starts to wash it out. So you'd really have from around 10:30 until around 1 when the moon comes up. Although then you could use the moon to illuminate the foreground. September 25th, dark from 9 till 6. Galactic center now is rising in the middle of the afternoon, but setting relatively shortly after sunset. And in fact, this particular night, the moon sets at 7:15. So you would have from around 11 o'clock till 11:30, and then the Milky Way is gone. So next, how do I know this? I used the photographer's ephemeris to put in these dates and then look at those key times for sunrise, sunset, galactic center rise, galactic center setting, and so forth. And two good options are either the photographer's ephemeris or photo pills are a good way to keep track of what's happening. An upcoming good opportunity for the next new moon cycle, if we go out to May 30th, so about a week from now, it'll be dark from 10:30 until 4:30. Galactic center rises at 10:20, and the moon rises at 1:24. So on that night, you would have from around 11:30 or 12 until around 1:30 in the morning to get good Milky Way photos. And as we go day by day from May 30 on, the moon will be rising later and later by about 40 minutes each night till we get to the new moon. So May 30th for the next week or two. Beyond that, you'll have good Milky Way shooting. So if that planning seems like it takes all the fun and joy out of photography, then just go out any night that you have available and enjoy the sky that's there and take your photos and enjoy what you get. There's nothing wrong with that approach either. Most importantly, though, is you want to focus on something interesting in the foreground and let the Milky Way be a background element. That once you master photographing the Milky Way itself, that we kind of all see the same Milky Way, and it's the foreground that makes your picture uniquely yours. So find an interesting foreground. Sometimes you may need to add a little light to make it more interesting or to reveal what's there. and let the Milky Way be a background rather than the main item of interest. And you'll notice in most of these, I was adding some sort of light to the foreground. A couple of different options for illuminating the foreground. You can light paint with a flashlight or an LED panel. You can photograph the foreground separately and blend it in Photoshop, or now you can use Photoshop's sky replacement with your own sky image. And you can photograph the foreground at dusk or at dawn, or if you time it right, you can use the moon and combine it with a moonlit image and a dark sky image taken just an hour apart. Or you can just let it be dark. And a lot of times silhouettes work out real nice with things like Joshua trees and features like that. When I'm planning, I like to do my scouting during the day. And one thing I'll do is pay attention to the clouds, if there are some, and kind of get my orientation and find some clouds that are going to be oriented about where the Milky Way is going to be that night. So on this particular day, I figured out that the Milky Way was going to be around the edge of this cloud bank on the right side of the frame. So then I could drive around, walk around, look for foreground features that lined up with that cloud bank, as long as I did it fairly quickly before the clouds moved. And once I found a spot that looked pretty promising, I could confirm with photo pills using the augmented reality to really confirm where's the Milky Way going to be that night, and then go back that night to take the picture. And this particular night, the moon was setting as the Milky Way was coming up, so I was able to do that trick of photographing the foreground using the moonlight for illumination in the foreground, and then photograph the sky separately after the moon set and combine the two images. So kind of in summary, you want to locate an interesting foreground, generally looking south towards the galactic center during the warm months of the year. So now and for the next few months, try to avoid the moon, and of course, try to avoid clouds. And photo pills or the photographer's ephemeris are both really good apps, and the photographer's ephemeris also has a good website with an online version, although the online version does not do night sky in particular, whereas the app on a phone or a tablet has both a night sky version or a night sky mode, as well as a sunrise sunset mode. I talk a little bit about ethics and etiquette when it comes to night sky. Digital techniques make it real easy to blend and composite frames and create images. And we need to all decide for ourselves what's right for us, and what do we feel comfortable with, and what do we not feel comfortable with. And generally, of course, we're practicing art, not journalism or forensics photography. So there's really no right or wrong, and don't let somebody tell you you're doing it wrong, because whatever is right for you is the right way to do it. But there are a lot of different ways to approach it. You can get good results with just a single frame. You have probably more limited opportunities to work that way, but you certainly can. And this is an example of a single frame photographed in RAW and then processed in Lightroom. This is a single frame, also photographed in RAW, but in this particular instance, the moon was coming up. We were getting real close to dawn, and you can see that the sky was beginning to really wash out the Milky Way. So in this case, I chose to use another version, another sky version that I'd photographed just about an hour earlier before the moon was coming up, and put it in the same place. So this is really a plausible sky. It's real, but the sky was replaced with a cleaner version photographed a little bit earlier. Going a little bit further, this was a scene of some silos in the Midwest, and the Milky Way is back here, but it's really washed out by light pollution. And also there's a really bright low pressure sodium light fixture that's blasting out light and lighting up this whole area with this ugly orange light. But with some processing and using a cleaner version of the sky, you can get a much more interesting version. Is that still a photograph? Is that, within your comfort zone? That's up to you. You can also composite over time. In this case, the cactus was photographed as the sun was setting. The lights from the cars going down Interstate 15 was after sunset. And then the Milky Way was a series of photos stacked, all taken from the same location, same night, but these are 3 different points in time. This is from Death Valley. The foreground is looking south, so this is about where the Milky Way should be, I believe, in this image, but I don't know because I was there at sunset and I didn't see the Milky Way, but I put it where I think it belongs. So it's feasible, but I can't tell you for sure that's where it belongs. And lastly, this is just an out and out composite. This is looking north along Interstate 15. The cactus is composited in. The sky glow over St. George is replaced with the Milky Way looking south. So you could not go take this picture because this is looking north and the Milky Way is there. But it makes a nice picture. Frequently, when we're out taking night sky images, we're shooting with friends or sometimes just with acquaintances that aren't our friends, but it's still important to play nicely with others. And the first rule of playing nice with others when you're doing night sky photography is put your flashlight away. Let your eyes adjust. You'll be able to see a lot. In fact, even under starlight, once your eyes really adjust, you can walk around in fairly uneven terrain and do just fine without any kind of a flashlight. If you drove a car to a meetup location and you know you're going to be leaving before other people, try to be considerate, try to park with your headlights pointed away from the group. Be cautious when you leave so that you don't blast the whole area with your headlights and ruin everybody's night vision. If you are going to use a flashlight, warn others, ask permission, say, hey, I'm going to use a flashlight or I'm going to light paint that. Is that okay? Or am I going to screw up somebody else? And a lot of times you'll wind up synchronizing so that one person will light paint and several other people will take images all at the same time, but you do have to communicate and let people know what you're doing. And red headlamps are a real good way to find your way around if you're not comfortable with just using your night vision. But again, be careful when you're wandering around with your headlamp. You might wind up wandering through somebody's picture and creating something different than what they had in mind. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of different options for your workflow. The simplest, of course, is just to take a single photo in JPEG mode, which is what this is. Camera on a tripod, take a picture with the settings I talked about earlier, and you're done. No more work needed, and you can get some nice pictures that way. If you'd like to do a little bit more, be sure you're using raw mode if you can, and then process the photo in Lightroom, and you can adjust the colors, tweak the contrast, brightness, and really bring out more of that Milky Way than what you can see in a JPEG straight from the camera most of the time. So that's a really good option if you're comfortable shooting in RAW and working in Lightroom. The better pictures that you see frequently are taken as multiple frames and almost always in RAW mode. And they use a stacking process to reduce noise. And the reason that works is because digital noise is random. And when you average multiple pictures together, the noise averages out, so you get a much cleaner image. And that lets you brighten the dark areas more aggressively to bring out more of those details in the night sky and especially in the Milky Way. And you can do that in Photoshop if you know how, but there's also some programs that are designed specifically for stacking Milky Way night sky images when the sky is moving and the foreground is not. And it will stack multiple frames and it will pick one frame to use as a single foreground so that you get a nice clean foreground, and it will align and stack the stars for the sky and do a fairly decent job with the transition from sky to foreground. And it depends on whether you're using a Mac or a Windows computer. If you're using a Mac, then you'll want to use Starry Landscape Stacker. If you're on Windows, then you'll use Sequitur. And they do basically the same thing. They work very similarly. It's just that one is Mac and one is Windows. And then, of course, you can finish that in Lightroom or Luminar or whatever processing software you like to use. The most complex is to take multiple frames using some sort of a tracking device that will track the movement of the sky. Of course, then you're almost always going to be shooting in RAW mode. Stack the sky frames, process that finished sky stack in Lightroom or Luminar or Photoshop or your software of choice. Process foreground frame or frames in Lightroom, Luminar, Photoshop, whatever, and then blend those images together. You can use something like Photoshop sky replacement or layers and masking to blend the two together in Photoshop to create the finished image. And that will give you the best results, but it's by far the most work, the most time consuming. Single frame is simple. Just use a wide angle lens, a high ISO, relatively short shutter speed of 15 to 30 seconds, and you're good to go. Complex, you're still going to use high ISO, but multiple frames. If you're using a tracking mount, you're not limited to just a wide angle lens. You can use a longer focal length to zoom in on some of the features in the sky or to change the relationship of foreground and background. You can use a longer shutter speed to capture more light. And when it comes to night photography, light is king. You can stack, and that does a lot, but longer shutter speeds will always collect more light. And you can go beyond 3 seconds, 30 seconds, up to 300 seconds frequently, and then stack the frames together to reduce noise. The equipment is much more simple for a simple photograph, much more complex with lenses, tripods, tracking mounts, and post-processing software if you're going to try to blend. When you're tracking, the goal of tracking is to get pinpoint stars because surprisingly, the stars move pretty quickly, or they appear to move pretty quickly because of the rotation of the Earth. And what a tracking mount does is follow the motion of the sky as it's moving, and that's what allows for longer exposures. Stacking, I mentioned, is to reduce noise, and that lets you more aggressively brighten dark areas to bring out those subtle differences in tones to bring out the details in the Milky Way. I think I mentioned earlier, sequitur or starry landscape stacker. This is just an example of with and without tracking, and in a wide view, you don't see much difference. And in fact, you might even think that the one on the right, which is the one without tracking, even looks better because you can see the stars a little bit more. And I don't know how well you can see it on the Zoom video, but if we zoom in, it's very clear on the left that with tracking, we have round stars, and without tracking, we have little tiny star trails. And this is photographed at 30 seconds with a 24 millimeter lens. And that's on a full frame camera. That would be roughly equivalent to a 16 millimeter lens on an APS-C type camera. It's a wide angle, but it's not really super wide angle. And even at 30 seconds, we're beginning to see fairly distinct star trails. And ironically, the better the lens, the more pronounced the star trails are, because if you have a less capable lens, those star trails will just be fuzzy dots and you won't see a distinct trail. So sometimes a cheaper lens will appear to give you better results. Stacking, this is an image straight from the camera, very dark, hard to see much of anything. When we brighten it up, we can see more detail, but a lot of grain, a lot of digital noise, real, fuzzy, pixelated. But by stacking, in this case, 49 frames stacked and processed, the noise mostly disappears and we can bring out a lot more of the detail. A little bit about color before we get into the nuts and bolts. Again, this is fine art. We're not trying to be scientists or crime scene investigators. So you can choose what color you want your night sky to be. It's a little bit like choosing what color of invisible ink you want to draw with. Do you want an accurate night sky color? Do you want a pleasing night sky color? Do you want dramatic colors? Choice is up to you. And with cameras and post-processing, you can choose to exaggerate or you can choose to subdue the colors. In general, colors and processing will tend to exaggerate the colors and contrast though. So just, kind of bear that in mind. You may have to dial it back if you don't want dramatic colors. So Dr. Roger Clark, who is, I'm sure, far more qualified than I, he's a PhD in planetary science from MIT with an expertise in using spectrometers. So he probably knows color a lot better than I do. And he claims in this picture that he took that these are the natural colors of the night sky, that the Milky Way is actually kind of a rusty red color. And the green color that you see here is not northern lights, it's air glow. And that's the nitrogen and the oxygen in the sky glowing a little bit. It's similar phenomenon to the northern lights, but it happens everywhere. It's not just the aurora borealis, but the sky is never completely dark, and usually it's glowing with this kind of greenish air glow. And on a really dark sky, as you get longer and longer exposures and capture more and more light, you'll see more and more of this green glow in the pictures, and that's the air glow. That may be accurate, but it may not be pleasing. So here's an example of a photo just taken on daylight white balance, and there's a lot of light pollution here, but it has a very pronounced kind of orangish red color from the color of the light pollution. With some adjustments to contrast and brightness, it brings out the Milky Way, but it also really intensifies that orangish color of the sky and makes it less pleasing. But that's on a daylight white balance. On an auto white balance, it shifts to more of a bluish color. And that's also with the brightness and contrast adjustments. This is a custom, so this would be probably around 4,000 Kelvin, adjusting the color balance in Lightroom until I feel like I had a pleasing balance between the color of the Milky Way and the color of the sky. So, you can choose, especially with post-processing, what color do you want it to be, and you're not constrained to have a blue sky or a green sky or a black sky. You can make it whatever you want. So what do you need? Well, as I mentioned before, you need a camera with a wide angle lens, and we're using a wide angle because that will minimize star trails. That will keep everything, all of those things small in the scene. A wide angle lens will let you use a longer exposure time. And for the most part, a kit lens that came with a mirrorless or a DSLR will probably work just fine. You do need a steady tripod, and notice I've underlined steady. The tripod has one job to do, and that's not wiggle when you take the picture. So be sure that you've got a good, steady, stable tripod. Your exposure is really constrained by the motion of the stars, or that apparent motion, I should say. And the aperture is fixed by the lens or the telescope if you're using a telescope. So you generally want to use the largest aperture that you have available, and that's going to be the smallest f numbers. And it could be f2.8, it could be f4, maybe f4.5, depending on the lens. The shutter speed is limited by the apparent motion of the stars, and if you're tracking, by your tracking accuracy. And then the ISO is the variable that you use to make it all work. Now, most modern cameras are ISO invariant. And what that means is whether you use, for instance, an ISO 3200 or ISO 1600 and add one stop of brightening and post-processing, you'll end up with essentially the same photo. So if you're going to do post-processing, you don't necessarily need to crank the ISO up into real high territory. Instead, you can increase it in post-processing and get the same noise result, and sometimes get a little bit better results in the colors of the stars. So you'll need to use manual focus because autofocus just flat won't work. So choose a manual exposure somewhere in the ISO 2600 to 3200 range, wide open, and 30 seconds. That's a good starting point. And like I said, don't trust your LCD preview. Don't look at the image and say, oh, wow, I can go with a 10-second exposure and it looks just fine. It's probably misleading. Tungsten or auto white balance, or you can dial in something like 4,000 Kelvin and use a self timer or remote release to avoid jiggling the camera. And if you know how to use the mirror lockup on your DSLR, if you still have a mirror, using that will also help jiggling the camera. There's a 500 rule that if you don't want to use that wide angle lens, you can use the 500 rule to estimate how long an exposure you can use depending on the focal length of the lens. And basically what you need to do is divide 500 by the focal length of the lens. So when it comes to math, a lot of people lose interest. So the short version of it is with a 16 millimeter lens, you can use a 31-second exposure. The longer the focal length, like a 24 millimeter, there you're limited to around 20 seconds. A 50 millimeter lens is going to be limited to around 10 seconds, 100 millimeter lens to around 5 seconds. A 300 millimeter lens that's really getting into long focal length territory, now you're limited to just 1.6 seconds before you really see significant star trailing. If you're using a cropped sensor camera, then you might want to use 300 instead of 500. But the moral of the story is the longer the focal length, the shorter the shutter speed has to be to avoid photographing tiny star trails instead of pinpoint stars. And generally, nice round pinpoint stars are kind of the litmus test that you're looking for to be a good night sky image. I talked about focusing in the dark. That's probably one of the toughest challenges. You want to switch to live view. Point the camera at the brightest star you can find. If the moon is up, sometimes you can autofocus on the moon and then switch from autofocus to manual focus, and the lens will stay put. Zoom your view, not the lens. Don't zoom the lens if it's a zoom lens, but you can still zoom in on your preview image, on your live view image, and get a closer look at that bright star, and then manually focus the lens to make that star as small as possible, and then don't touch the focus for the rest of the night. Some people will even put a piece of tape over the focus ring to avoid accidentally moving it. And that's probably where people have the most trouble. And I would recommend practicing all of these things, the switching to live view, manually focusing, setting your manual exposure. Practice all those things in the afternoon or evening before it's dark, so you're not trying to figure it out in the middle of the night when you're out there stumbling around in the dark. Take your photo. Once you focus, you can point the camera anywhere and the stars are all going to be basically at infinity. So if you focused on one star, you're focused for any star. Then it's a matter of finding an interesting foreground and using the self timer and mirror lockup to avoid shake, and then enjoy and share the results. So kind of in summary, warm months is where the Milky Way is at, generally looking south. You'll want to shoot in RAW mode if you can, use a sturdy tripod, manually focus in live view to make the stars as small as possible, use manual exposure around ISO 2600 to 3200, the smallest F number at around 20 to 30 seconds. Don't trust the camera's LCD. Tungsten or auto white balance usually will work well. Use mirror lockup if you can, and a self timer to avoid jiggling the camera. And this is just an example when I talk about the complex process to kind of help visualize it. This end result is 5 frames stacked for the sky, and then 10 frames, in fact, stacked under the moonlight for the foreground. And these are the settings I used, ISO 1600, 60-second exposures at f5 for the sky, and wound up actually using the same settings for the foreground, but more frames. So I photographed the foreground as the moon was setting, so we get a nice shadow from this little peak on the hillside. And this was at Capitol Reef, by the way. And the foreground is nice and steady, but you can see there's a lot of movement in these stacked images of the foreground because of the motion in the sky. Separately, I stacked the images of the sky, and this was after the moon set, so the foreground now is just a silhouette. And in fact, if we look at the individual frames for the sky, you'll see from the first frame to the second frame, if you watch the silhouette, to the third frame, to the fourth frame, you can see that it's moving. Go backwards, you can see it's moving a little bit, and it's not really moving, obviously. It's the tracker following the stars as they appear to move, setting in the west. They all always rise in the east and set in the west. And then you can put that together in a combined blended image using the foreground image with the moon and the sky after the moon set when it was nice and dark. And the reason we use a tracker is because the stars are appearing to, as I said, rise in the east and set in the west. And if you look due north at the North Star, that's about where the center of rotation is. That's where the North Celestial Pole is. So if anything that's rotating in sync with the sky will be following those stars as they appear to rise in the east and set in the west. If you're at the equator, you would be looking at 0 degrees at the North Pole. This would be 90 degrees directly overhead. For us here in St. George, we're at 37 degrees north, so it's about 37 degrees up in the sky. So if you're using a star tracker, its axis of rotation is aligned to that North Celestial Pole, and then it slowly turns in sync with the sky. And it doesn't matter where you point the camera. What matters is where you point the axis of this tracker. So I typically will use a ball head mounted right on the front of the tracking device. It's rotating around that axis, but I can point the camera south, north, straight up, anywhere I want, and it's going to follow the sky because the tracker is aligned with the North Celestial Pole. So that lets you go to longer times, makes stacking a lot easier, but it's much more complex. So just a quick example. A few weeks ago, I was at Death Valley. We were camping in the Furnace Creek area. I checked my apps in the photo pills and the photographer's ephemeris, and I knew the galactic center was going to be rising around 3 o'clock, but it would need an hour or so to really get up in the air. But sunrise was around 6, so it was going to start getting bright pretty quickly after the galactic center was up high. But I wanted to make the most out of that fairly short window. So what I did, first, I went to Zabriskie Point, which is fairly close to Furnace Creek, if you're familiar with that area. And I knew I could get up a little bit of elevation in the overlook area and have a clear view of the Milky Way to the south. So I went there and I took a series of photos of the sky focusing on the Milky Way. And I got some foreground, but my intent was really to get a good, clean picture of the Milky Way. As soon as I got that, I scampered back down to the car and went to the 20 Mule Team area where I could get closer to some interesting foregrounds and start photographing foregrounds to go with the Milky Way. We looked at this picture earlier, and I knew that I would come back and use that Milky Way sky image to replace the one that was washed out to create a more interesting foreground. But then I also started getting into some sunrise, and the sun was starting to come up. Unfortunately, we had some interesting clouds. This is a crescent moon that was just rising in that earlier picture. So I could start photographing the foreground with an idea of the sunrise. And as the sun was coming up, I could really get double duty out of some of the images. I could light paint a foreground with the dawn sky behind it, or I could also use that as a Milky Way image. And then I finished up by going back up to Zabriskie Point to the overlook and photographed the foreground. Now, with the sun coming up, had a lot of color in the sky, but I also had a lot of light on the foreground, so I could get the foreground image that I could then combine with the Milky Way I took about an hour and a half earlier to create a finished night sky image that also included a lot of detail in the foreground. Lastly, let's talk about the moon. The moon is a night sky feature that a lot of people like to photograph. And if you've ever tried it, you've probably discovered that it is really bright. And the reason it's really bright is because it's lit by the sun, just like we are during the daytime. So the moon is really a daylight exposure. And if you're an old film photographer, you may remember the Sunny 16 rule, where you used f16 and a shutter speed equal to the ASA rating of the film. Well, there's a Looney 11 rule that you can use for a full moon as a starting point, where you set the shutter speed equal to the ISO, or the ISO equal to your shutter speed at f11, and that will give you a pretty good exposure setting for the lit portion of the moon. So for instance, ISO 100, 1/100th of a second at f11, and that will give you a good exposure for a full moon or a half lit moon, whether it's at dusk, sunset, middle of the night. The moon is the same brightness regardless of when you look at it. So that's a pretty good exposure setting for the moon. Frequently, though, if it's other than dawn or dusk, when the light all just kind of balances out, you may need to use HDR blending techniques to photograph the moon and photograph a foreground and blend them together, so that you don't have just one big bright blob for the moon or a completely black foreground. Because using these settings, even all the stars will disappear. If Jupiter or Saturn are in the picture, they're bright enough to photograph with those settings, but you won't see any stars. If you want stars and the moon, you'll have to blend it together. And we were talking at the beginning about the upcoming lunar eclipse this Wednesday morning at the crack of dawn. There will be a total lunar eclipse, and we'll be catching just a portion of it as the sun is coming up. So it'll be very low in the southwest, like 10 degrees above the horizon low. So that's really low. They call it a blood moon because it turns red as it moves into the shadow of the earth, but it will also be probably turning red just because it's so low on the horizon. So you may get a very dramatic orangish red moon. It may disappear as the sun is coming up because the sky will get too bright and wash it out because it won't be very bright. But if you're interested in photographing it, this is a good opportunity to find an interesting foreground that will complement the moon, and use that with probably a long or telephoto lens to get some compression so that the moon is large relative to your foreground object. And experiment with settings that, because this is an eclipsed moon, the Looney 11 settings won't work. So you'll need to experiment with other settings to find something that works. But for the most part, if you can see it, you can photograph it. And I am all out of slides. So I didn't hear any questions along the way. If you have any, now would be a good opportunity.
Could you just talk a little bit about light painting in terms of like what kind of a flashlight do you use, the power, and the technique involved?
Yeah, light painting is a real good way to add light to a foreground. If you're shooting at high ISOs and relatively long shutter speeds, which you usually are, you'll be amazed at how little light it really needs. If you're using an LED flashlight, sometimes a dimmer one will work better than a bright one. Sometimes, a lot of times mine will be too bright and I'll hold my fingers over the flashlight and just let a little tiny sliver of the light through to keep it from being too bright, or just very quickly turn it on and off. If you're painting hills or something that are a couple 100 feet away, then you can use a longer time with the flashlight. Some people like to use what's called low-level lighting, where they use a very dim LED panel that you can turn down so dim that by eye you almost don't even see the effect. But then again, when you take that long exposure at a very high ISO, lighting that you can't see all of a sudden becomes real bright and visible in the image. So it takes a little trial and error. But in general, I would say the danger is that you'll have too much light from your flashlight rather than too little.
So one of these puppies wouldn't work, eh?
It will if you're trying to light up something in the distance. The farther away it is, the more light you need, because light falls off with the square of the distance. In other words, it's falling off twice as fast as the distance is falling off. So you know, a lot of times, I don't know if I can go back to one of the images earlier. If I'm doing light painting, you know, I will try to shine the light more on the area in the distance than up close. So I might just very quickly flick it across the foreground and then spend more time with it pointed at the objects in the distance. You know, same way here, I try to point it in the distance and let the fall off illuminate the foreground.
Okay, in our chat, Bill B tells us there is an app to use for light painting.
Okay.
It allows you to adjust brightness and color called Screen Flashlight.
Good to know.
And Bruce and I have also experimented a while back with using off-camera flash to light paint with. And we had some decent results with that.
Yeah, that can work well too. The
Yeah.
times I've used it, the problem I had was that it was trying to dial the flash down dim enough and get far enough away to not just blow out the foreground. But I wasn't using a very good flash at the time, and so I couldn't dial it down very much.
Yeah, and it also depends on what you want to light paint on that. The other thing we've used is with our flashlights, if we couldn't dial them down enough, is actually like layers of your t-shirt that you're wearing.
Yep.
To help block some of the light. You know, like, oh, well, 3 layers of cotton t-shirt works really well, whereas 1 layer didn't. So it's a lot of experimentation with light painting.
Yeah, and there's if you're comfortable photographing the foreground and the sky separately, that gives you a lot more freedom to turn your ISO down and use a brighter flashlight and, you know, get a really nice, clean, illuminated version of the foreground, and then blend that with a longer exposure of the sky.
We had a couple other presentations on night sky, and they had a couple good tips too. If you're shooting like red rocks around here, put some kind of a orangish gel over the light. It gives a lot better look on the rocks. Otherwise, they kind of look washed out. The other thing I think Jeff mentioned was to try to light paint something close at an angle, not straight on, but sideways, so you get some depth in the foreground.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
You can spend hours out experimenting with light painting. And it can be kind of fun, so.
Yeah, light painting probably could be a whole presentation in itself.
And yet I've never found, I just, you know, in talking to people that try to do the light painting, I have yet to find somebody who have felt that they have like got it down so they could teach it to somebody. You know, it's like, oh, it's just kind of all experimentation, even with the low level lighting guys. You know, they have their things, they set them up and they're still like, yeah, it could be a whole, right, you're right, a whole presentation in and of itself if I could find somebody that actually is confident enough in their skills in light painting to get us some facts and, you know, some success stories.
Yeah, so much of it, I've done a lot of it, but so much of it is going to be different depending on the subject and the situation. I think the thing Bruce mentioned is probably one of the most important things to keep in mind, and that's don't just stand next to the camera and shine the light on it, because that'll give you very flat, uninteresting light. That if you can turn on the camera and then run away from it so you're pointing the light from the side, that'll give you a lot more detail, a lot more interesting image.
Yeah. And I've had, you know, back to the speed light thing, I've had some pretty good luck with that. You put it in manual mode, you turn it down really low, you know, and then you can flash multiple areas that you want. And I found that if it's not enough light, which I've had a few times, you flash it 2 or 3 times.
Yep.
During a long exposure, you've got a lot of latitude to run around. And
yeah, especially if you're trying to light something large that you have to be back a ways, like a building at Grafton or something. I can see that working real well.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And could you talk a little bit about how you created that image that included the flowering cactus?
Which one of the cactus?
I think it was a few slides later than the one that's currently shown on your screen. I feel like a saguaro, I think. That
Oh,
had some,
let's see.
Another tip when you're out shooting with friends on the lights is remember to turn off your interior auto light in case you need to open the car door during the shoot. Embarrassing when that light comes on and it won't go off for several minutes. Now to the saguaro.
Yeah, in fact, and sometimes if you open your car door, your headlights come on too, and that can be embarrassing. Yeah. So is this the one you were talking about? We were this is in a campground. It's actually a county park on the east side of the Phoenix area, kind of up at the base of the Superstition Mountains. And we walked outside of our camper around dusk and happened to look out and saw the moon. And I thought, gosh, there was still some light in the sky, but it was getting pretty dark. Saw the half moon, so I grabbed my camera and found a saguaro that I thought would make a good foreground and took that picture, or at least a version of the picture. I had to take several different frames of the moon because it was, it was too dark to photograph the cactus and the moon in one frame. So the moon was photographed at a faster shutter speed to keep from blowing it out. The cactus was really kind of flat lighting because it was dusk. So I added this kind of spotlight effect in post to give it a little bit nicer look. And I added a couple of flowers also in post from a different cactus because this was taken at sunset. And if you're familiar with saguaros, generally the flowers don't look very good at sunset. They look good early in the morning at sunrise. So there was a fair amount of Photoshop work putting this together, but the basic image was taken maybe 20 feet from our camper with a 70 to 200 zoom.
thank you. That's a cool image.
So another question off of chat is, what time do you think you have to get up on Wednesday for the eclipse? Now, I do have an article that I found here that the actual totality of the eclipse is only going to last for 14 minutes. It's a very short lunar eclipse. So the actual totality is only going to be 14 minutes. But has anybody done any of the digging up for times and calculations to see, when moonrise and moonset is? Does anybody have any info on that? Or do we need to just all figure that out for ourselves? Wednesday.
I can give it to you real quick here.
Okay. So that is on the morning of the 26th.
The morning of the 26th, the moon set is at 6:26. Sunrise is at 6:18. So the sun will already be up before the moon sets. The full moon, which is going to be the peak of the eclipse, is at 5:14.
And that's the peak of the eclipse. So that would be the totality then.
Yes. And that's going to be during nautical twilight and before civil twilight. So that's going to be about an hour before sunrise.
Yeah. So
you would probably want to get out there, I guess, as early as you can stand it. 4:30, 5 o'clock, something like that. No later than 5 o'clock, but.
Oh, because your totality will be at 5.
Yeah, if totality is at 5:14.
Yeah. But it really depends on what your goal is going to be on that photo shoot. If you're going to try to catch, beginning to end, or if you're not going to be able to probably get end. You'll have too much sunlight by then, or the moon will be gone.
Yeah, and it's going to be very low.
Yeah.
I think it's going to, at totality, I think it's going to be around 10 degrees above the horizon, which is really low.
Especially for here with our mountains.
Yeah. Yeah, so you don't want to be, if you're thinking you'll photograph it behind a mountain, don't get too close to the mountain.
One tip I can give you, it's not really a tip, but it's a mistake that I made the first time when I tried to photograph an eclipse. I saw, people were posting these photos, you set the camera stationary and you composite images of the different phases of the eclipse as it goes across the sky. So you start out with I don't know, where I don't know the correct terms there, but it starts out with a sliver and then it gets bigger and then it gets smaller across the sky. Well, I set up my camera and just, told it to take a picture every so often and did that. And I found out that the exposure varies so much between full eclipse and, full moon that it didn't turn out at all. Most of the frames didn't. So you kind of got to adjust the exposure between frames too.
Yeah, in fact, even when the moon is fully eclipsed, there's still kind of a brighter area on it most of the time because it's not exactly centered in the Earth's shadow. And just the exposure difference between that bright area of the moon and the darker area of the moon will typically be beyond what you can get in one exposure.
Right. So you probably want to bracket or manually adjust exposure because a lot of my frames were just completely black because, with like the slivers and stuff, there wasn't enough light coming through.
Yeah, and I suspect that since totality is going to be in, approaching civil twilight, it's very possible the sky will be so bright that it'll wash out the moon and you won't see the moon at all.
Okay, Bob Beal gave us a reference from Sky and Telescope telling us the partial eclipse will start at 3:45 a.m. Totality is between 5:10 and 5:28 a.m. and it sets at sunrise before the eclipse ends. Thanks, Bob. And also a clear sky chart can help you to figure out if you can figure out how to read it. There's a link for that. I love that. Thanks for the presentation. It was great. So I will make sure that these little chat things get on the meetup so you can see them on the meetup as comments.
Is there time for one more question?
Sure there is.
Yeah, Craig, if I'm shooting the Milky Way and I don't have a tracker on, and so I need to be at a really pretty fast speed, right, with a wide angle lens, I'm wondering how many photographs do you think that I need to take to stack to get a really vibrant image like some that you've done? I don't think I could ever do them that great, but how many pictures would I need to take, do you think?
Probably around 10. You'll see a real noticeable difference between 1 and 10. Okay. I've heard people say as many as 20. One of the problems is the more frames you're trying to take, the more time is going by and the more the stars move. And so the edges start getting a little flaky and some of the stars start going behind obstructions. If you remember the picture I showed that I said was a single image taken with the little tree in Zion. If I can get back to that one real quick. That would be a fairly difficult one to do with stacking. And the reason is because of the tree. That you can see stars through the tree and around the tree, and the tree's kind of in the middle of everything. So, a picture like this where you've got gaps and trees sticking up. If I was using a tracker, yeah, I could get good, clean data up in the main part, but all along the edges is going to be real problematic. Because the foreground is going to be blurred and stretched out. And so with that kind of a foreground, a single frame really is the best way to go.
Okay.
Or get really good at masking and compositing. Yeah, 20 to 30 seconds and 10 exposures will probably give you real good results most of the time.
Okay.
I think you just got the 14 millimeter lens and you're using that
I-
on a full frame, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, 20 to 30 seconds should work fine.
Okay.
As you add frames, it's kind of a doubling thing. So from 1 to 2, you're getting double the information. Then you have to go to 4 to double it again, and then to 8 to double it again, then to 16 to double it again, then to 32 to double that result. So you really get to a point of diminishing returns somewhere around 8 or 10, I think.
Okay, great. Well, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Well, I want to thank Craig for doing this for us tonight. And I'm going to stop the recording now. Hopefully.